All right, Hollie. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to chat with me. I know I'm right up there with all the other podcast people that you've been up with, like Jocko and Andy Stump and She or Her News. So I'm just as big as them.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I was really interested in your work. I've known about your work for a while now, and thought your background was really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about, like, I think you were like a former dancer in ballet, and then you went to journalism, or was that all at the same time? So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so I grew up in Australia, really far. Sort of, my parents are from north of Cairns, so it's sort of a beautiful, tropical kind of rainforesty area, and sort of my dad was in the mine, so we moved around a little bit into really country places. And so I went to boarding school when I was a teenager, and I really loved ballet, and I was very athletic. I played a lot of sports, but I really loved, I think, more the creative aspect of dancing, sort of the choreography and this sort of idea of being transported to different places. And so just because we were in the country and so opportunities were fairly limited, I was fortunate enough to go to a boarding school in Sydney where it was a performing arts college. So I could do my ballet and dancing and then do my academics at the same time. So that was a really sort of beautiful. And I thought that I would sort of go into the arts, whether that was into, choreography or to dancing or to sort of something that was sort of very creative. But I ended up breaking my ankle. And so I went back to study. The university thing really wasn't for me. I went to night school. I still worked full time. I was still doing dancing jobs. I was doing a lot of commercial work, once my ankle had healed. So I was traveling kind of all over. And I think, the university was just a little bit of a sort of an afterthought for me. And definitely looking back on it, I pretty much phoned it in. So I guess in the last part of my degree, I decided that I wanted to get out of Australia and go somewhere else. And my university, which was affiliated with a small university in New York City. So I thought that was a really cool opportunity to go. I'd worked so much throughout college that I, had a good stack of money from all the commercial work. So I was sort of able to go and spend that last semester in New York and live the beautiful New York life, which, when you're 20, I think I turned 21. When I was there, it was all very surreal. And I ended up getting this internship, and I didn't know what an internship was. It really wasn't something that we had in Australia at that time. You kind of just worked. Everybody worked and did their thing, or if you did want to do some sort of, I guess, internship, it was just sort of considered you do a week of work experience. So it was just a very different dynamic. I always loved to write, but I never really pondered the idea of journalism as a career. As I said, I was sort of willing or ready to go back into that dance world. And then I ended up getting this internship, and this was in 2006. It was really early in the digital era. It was at the time when everybody wanted to still be in broadcast, and to really, and for me, I think I had some web code experience from university, and because I love to write, and I really didn't harbor any great interest or desire to sort of be on camera. That really wasn't what I wanted to do. So I was able to go into, I guess, a new department at that point, and be part of that. And they offered to sponsor me and keep me in the country once I'd finished. So I was very young and very green and had a lot to learn, but it was a sort of a fantastic opportunity to kind of stay and be in this big news world.
I think that's one of the first things that, if I could change something, at least when I was starting out, I've always been freelance. I've always stayed independent, and even when I was in college and after college. But I do wish I joined like an internship at a big major network and learned. And I'm sure you meet a lot of people, instead of like, once you like, if you're starting out, as you know, you're doing everything from finances to the business side to networking, and then finally pitch a story and then actually do the story. So I think I always kind of tell people, I know the media landscape is changing, like it feels like every year. So I don't know. I always tell, like, if you can intern with a big, at least if you want to be in journalism, I still think it's valuable to learn from the big mainstream people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get it's the freelancing world is certainly very different to the corporate world, but being part of that daily newsroom when you're working for a big outlet is certainly a very interesting and unique experience that some people love and other people hate. So yeah, certainly has its pros and cons, but I do appreciate having that experience and um, for good and for bad. But yes.
No, yeah. I mean, I have a lot of friends, as I'm sure you, who work in the, BBC and Fox News and CNN, and I still learn a lot from them. And there's a lot of times where, like, man, I wish I had those resources to to go do those stories. So, but yeah, I was wondering. So, what was your kind of when you first started getting into foreign affairs, conflict journalism? What was the first country, and what was some of the first stories that you did?
I mean, I traveled a lot. In my 20s, I was always constantly traveling. I sort of grown up in an area where there was a lot of Lebanese people, so I'd learned to speak a little bit of Arabic, which I'm still trying to improve every day, but it's a struggle. But yeah, so
Yep.
I just was always a big traveler and always loved to go to different places. And even in my dance days and, as a teenager, I was always studying in different places and parts of the world. So that was always sort of really in my blood. In terms of work, I guess it was really sort of Arab Spring is where I really started to get interested in foreign affairs. Before that, I mean, I was general assignment. I did some entertainment. I did some crime. I was more of a court reporter than anything, which, was really interesting. I'd
Hmm.
cover different court cases, and I really loved the investigative aspect of journalism. I just remember, just covering really fascinating
Right.
things. And when there was breaking news or a terrorist attack or something, I'd sort of get thrown into that. But really, the investigative part is what I loved. And then, um, yeah, I didn't sort of initially ever dream of being, a conflict reporter. So, Arab Spring really piqued my interest. I thought that there was this sort of incredible revolution, and that's when I sort of got a lot more involved in it. And then I ended up working. The first time I worked in the Middle East was, I guess, 2000 and what I would say. I mean, sort of travel work, but more work centered was, yeah,
Yeah.
probably the Gaza Israel conflict, so 2013 into 2014. And then, really at that time, that's when the ISIS situation was kind of bubbling over. And so that's when I started to kind of basically live in between Iraq and Syria and sort of cover that from a ground perspective. And it was, yeah, one of those just sort of, I think, very seminal situations. And given the importance of Iraq to many Americans, I felt that that was sort of an important situation with so many different elements that really needed to be covered.
I would I would say Iraq is like was a second home for me, and I spent a lot of time there. Like in 2010, I started going, and then I would make 4 or 5 trips out of the year, and then up until COVID, that was like I had a period where I would go visit every year, and so I broke that streak.
Yeah, I just came back from Baghdad a few weeks ago. Yeah, I was so excited to go back because I hadn't been back 20. I couldn't remember if it was 2019 or 2018 that I was last there, but yeah, it was so beautiful in a way to kind of go back there. I really love that city.
I read your last article about Baghdad, and also covered other things of is ISIS returning, or is it just very like still insurgency for most people, and the still the political difficulties of Iraq and the parliament and the corruption. So I was reading. So I had a couple of questions. So what was it like being in Baghdad, and then um, are people still worried more about ISIS, or is it more just like a political between the Shia and Sunni political leaders and religious leaders. I'm just kind of curious what your take on it.
Yeah, I think in Baghdad, people aren't that concerned about ISIS. I mean, obviously, people are aware
Mm-hmm.
that things are still happening in Ramadi and Fallujah and places that have long been problem spots, the very sort of Sunni dominant areas. So I think people in Baghdad aren't hugely worried about it, but I think for them, it's looking at, not really have a functioning government. People are concerned about the Iran-backed militias. And then you have all the basic concerns that we all have. And, at the end of the day, everybody wants to survive. And in Iraq, that is a very difficult place, just in terms of cost of living, corruption, that lack of freedom. So there are sort of a lot of the things that day-to-day people are grappling with. And I really think, as well as, you've just got so many ramifications from the ISIS conflict. And, it's been 5 years since Iraq declared ISIS defeated in Iraq. And yet there's so many spiraling problems. And it's hard to wrap your head around, I think, sometimes. I'm sure you'd agree. It's just, once a conflict goes away and it ends, we have a tendency to move on. I think it's ended, but it just hasn't. And in many ways, it becomes worse because then the people that need it aren't getting the funding that they need, or they're not, when it's no longer in the headlines, it's no longer, sexy to donate to it. And people really are hurting in so many ways. And a few things, a couple of op-eds and things that I wrote about looking at the level of stateless children in Iraq. You've got these children that were born to ISIS fathers, and they have no documents, and the Iraqi government won't give them documents because their fathers were Daesh. I mean, but these are children, these are babies, these are when they're going into school age now, and this is a problem because they can't register to go to school, they can't get medical help, they're completely ostracized. I mean, you can't even get through a checkpoint without documents, and so it's a really difficult. And also in Iraq, even if they're with their mothers, in Iraq, you have to assume the identity, the religion and the sort of the identity of the father. And so if the father was potentially a foreign fighter, then that's another level of a problem, because then Iraq's like, well, whoever the foreign fighter is, even if they don't know who it is, there's not really any DNA testing. So there's just so many spiraling problems. And then with the Yazidis, who are obviously, treated, horribly and taken as sex slaves by ISIS, they're hurting. There's still fighting going on in Sinjar with Turkey, and then between Yazidi resistance groups and the Iraqi army. So a lot of them are being displaced again. And then, something I looked into, which was really heartbreaking, was, the women that have had children with ISIS. Again, they can't be Yazidis. This part of the Yazidi culture is that they have to be, you can't be convert. Both parents have to be Yazidi. And obviously in this case, the parents are ISIS. And so they're not able to be Yazidi. And so that's really difficult for the mother. In many cases, the Yazidis were forced to have abortions either when they were with ISIS or when they came back. The Yazidi community forced that, and they won't accept the children. They'll take the women back, but won't accept them. So it's really, these are just things that it's hard to change. And the Turkmen population, which we really didn't hear much about throughout the ISIS reign, but, again, they're women, the Shia, the women, Turkmens were also taken by ISIS. And there's hundreds of them still missing. But the worst part is the community sort of doesn't even want to kind of find them because of the shame. And girls that even escaped were killed by their own families in these sort of honor killings. And it's so many levels of pain. And because it's such, you're looking at very closed cultures, I just don't know how what benefit the outside world can do in really changing that mindset. Fortunately, there are some good leaders and good NGOs and things who are trying, but you're looking at, centuries old doctrine that and it's just so painful to see the continuing pain. And again, the ramifications of what that conflict meant to the country.
Yeah, with the Yazidis, what government or who do they trust the most? Is the Iraqi government? Is it the different Kurds?
I don't really think they trust either. I think, this is, again, part of the problem is the Yazidis want to be somewhat independent. So this is causing resistance fighting with the Iraqi army. I mean, technically Sinjar is under the control of Baghdad. Back in the day, it used
Right.
to be under the control of the Kurdish government. It is in Baghdad terrain, but that's a problem on for them, and I think there is just a distrust of both sides there, and you have to remember that the day that ISIS came in, and that was sort of August, I think it was August 15 of 2014 to Sinjar.
Yeah,
That was
2015.
the Peshmerga who fled. So you had a group that was left absolutely defenseless, and of course, if that was any of us, I'm sure we would feel that sort of same sense of animosity. So it's just it's painful to sort of see that community ripped apart so much.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was in the back of my head as I was covering Iraq and going from all over Baghdad, Fallujah to Sinjar to Kirkuk, I was like, okay, everyone has a common enemy, which is ISIS. But the whole time I was just like, man, I don't know how this is all going to turn out once ISIS's territory is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess for the most part, it's somewhat like there hasn't been full out fighting each other. But I guess, it's still a very fragile region. There's a lot of different moving parts, and I think it's still in the process of figuring itself out.
Yeah, I don't know how quickly that will happen, but it's certainly full of different dynamics, and I think that's another thing. Even with my last trip to Baghdad, I thought about as someone who'd spent a lot of time in Iraq previously and reads a lot and sort of very invested in that part of the world. There is just nothing like being on the ground. You can read every analyst report out there. You can read every, think tank summary of a situation, and you can really think that you know everything about what's happening. But it's just, it blows my mind when you're there, even if it's for a short period, how much you can just learn, how much you learn. And that really blew my mind as someone who thought I knew a lot. And then just even returning, I was like, oh my goodness, like these nuances, these are the things that you never read about. You just don't understand, and you have to be there to really get it. And obviously, as journalists, we try to bring that back to some degree, but to bring it back accurately, it really reinforced to me that importance of spending that time on the ground, because there is no report that will ever sort of give you that comparison in the same way.
I completely agree. I say that about Iraq, and same kind of like Israel, Palestine, Gaza. I'm like, yeah, you really kind of have to you don't have to go to Gaza if you don't want to, obviously, but to go there is way different than watching.
Yeah, you have to go. You have to be able to talk to people from the West Bank. You have to be able to talk to Israelis. You have to be able to get as clear a picture as possible. And I always find it way more interesting to be talking to local people than any sort of government official, because they're always going to give you some sort of spun information or some kind of press release type stuff. And of course, you can poke holes in that and dig a little further. But to me, it's so much more interesting to sort of get that ground perspective where. And that is, I think, where the nuances really come in.
How do you work when you're approaching a story in country? Like for me, I try to have my local people, and I stay pretty small as a team wise. Maybe there's some other journalists that would go in, but as you know, like space is very limited, especially if you're rolling around in these type of countries. So do you like to collab with other journalists, or do you try to keep to yourself and hang out with the locals? What's kind of like your approach?
I pretty much do keep to myself. I do keep to myself. I generally hang with the locals. I've never ever gone anywhere with security teams or anything like that. Very occasionally, maybe really only Afghanistan, where I was living last year, was the only time I had a photographer with me, which was really nice because you had someone to share some logistical challenges. But pretty much it's me doing everything. And that was even the case when I was at Fox too. I wasn't, because I'm not a TV reporter, so I didn't get all the perks of producers and cameras and foreign desk. And, it was all really me. So I am used to that. That to me doesn't get very stressful because everything is on you, from getting the visas to, logistical challenges, and that's probably one of the biggest things that I'm a little bit burned out of, is just that you really have to do everything yourself, and when you're alone and you're budgeting, and it is a lot. So I do generally stay fairly local. I'm not really. I know a lot of people, a lot of journalists and things love to collaborate, but for me, I I think, yeah, especially for my Fox days, that wasn't something that we did. I wasn't. I don't want to do the same story somebody else is doing, and so that is important for me to kind of work alone. I think it would be a little uncomfortable, perhaps at times, if I was working with somebody that was doing sort of the exact same story and doing the same interviews. That would just be, I think, a little bit awkward. So I do sort of go out of my way to avoid that if possible. But generally, really try to go under the radar. Try not to draw any attention to myself, and definitely work with locals and kind of use them as my guide forward.
Yeah, I try to always try to highlight fixers on my podcast, just because they're literally like, at least for me, they're my babysitters when I go there. And if you
Yeah, I love my fixers.
So I was just wondering if you have like a specific fixer that you like to highlight, whether it's in Iraq or Ukraine. I would love to hear something.
Yeah, I think I was very close with my fixer in Syria. He, was just sort of this amazing human, Mazlum, and he, really took me in with his family, and we got to know each other very well, and you bond very quickly in those situations. I think when you're in sort of a tense situation, and you really rely on that person to kind of take care of you and pave the way. And so that was a really difficult, obviously, place to work. So I really relied on him to guide me the best way forward. And he was really just extraordinary, and his family was just wonderful. And I was really flattered. They ended up naming their first daughter Hollie, so that was really she's my little goddaughter. So that was really special. So he's somebody that I absolutely love and adore. But I've always had beautiful sort of relationships with most of my fixers, who I still talk to. I went back and worked with my fixer again in Baghdad this time. She's an incredible woman, and I've worked with her for many years. So I really loved seeing her again. I was on the phone just earlier this morning with my Afghan fixer that I worked with last year, and we sort of went to every province together. So he's sort of he's actually younger than me, but he feels like a big brother because he's so tall. but yeah, so we always chat, and yeah, I think for them too, it's nice to have a different kind of connection than the connections that they're used to having at home. So I try to really keep up with as many fixes in different places as possible, and sometimes that's hard. In war zones, people tend to disappear, or they you just lose communication with them. But wherever possible, I really loved. I've always had really fortunate kind of experiences with my fixes, so I've been very lucky in that way.
Yeah, me too. Like I would like go play poker, and I've never played poker until my first time, and I played with my fixer and all his friends, and I won that night. and nice. They were opening up a restaurant at the same time, and it was just a lot of fun. They would take me to go, people don't realize like northern Iraq has some beautiful, northern Kurdistan has some beautiful scenery and rivers and beautiful lakes. And so those are the things that I really enjoy. And but yeah, I wanted to talk about a little bit about your coverage in Ukraine, and just how your process of working there. It was very difficult getting around that country, especially in the early days of the invasion. I thought driving was really dangerous at that point. I was friends with Brent Renard, who was the American journalist who was killed, and then I was friends with the Danish journalist who was injured, and those were two people who, especially Brent, who I've known since I was in college, and so it was just logistically, that country to me, it was just really hard to get around, and then it's almost like you had to get to a main point of the city, and then it was like walking distance to get to your stories. So I just kind of wanted to hear a little bit of your experience, especially in the early days of Ukraine.
Yeah. So I was lucky. I'd been to Ukraine previously, so I'd sort of built friends and connections there in the government, and also with some NGOs and just locals. And I was in Europe in January doing some work, and figured at the end of January, when Ukraine was really in the news, that I would go back and see what was going on. So I kind of went there fairly early, and that was great because, again, I could re-establish my connections that I had, and this was before the invasion. So they took me to the east, and so I was able to spend a lot of time sort of in Donbass and a lot of the areas that have become very critical now, Mariupol. So that was really a interesting time, sort of through February, to sort of be there, and again, kind of twiddling your thumbs a little bit, not really clear or not really sure anything was going to happen, and kind of thinking, Russia surely is not going to go forward with this. There's just too much at stake. So when the invasion happened, I think it was quite a shock. It was really an eerie time, I think, especially, that first week, the first few days. I did find it difficult, to kind of work there. Just that so many people I knew had left. It was, logistically, the drivers, and then people, just kind of starting to price gouge a little bit, which is what I found, which is challenging when you're, a freelancer. You can't afford, people are trying to charge you what networks will pay. And obviously, as an individual writer, it's sort of like, no, I can't do that. I'm not Fox News anymore. I'm not the BBC. So, it's a different set of challenges. But again, I was sort of lucky that I had, local people that to kind of help me. And, a lot of the times I struggled with a fixer, and it wasn't really, finally I got somebody through somebody, and he was lovely, but he hadn't really done it before. So generally speaking, I just used my own connections to do my stories and to get where I needed to be. And I'd go out with different NGOs and to different places, and outside the city, depending on wherever I was covering, into Pin or wherever, Butcha. But yeah, again, Pierre, who was with Fox, who was killed, was my sort of go-to in Ukraine. He was kind of the person who I went to every day, and he was extremely supportive, obviously because I was at Fox for a long time, and so when he was killed, I kind of had enough, and I'd gotten really bad third-degree burns on my legs. So I was struggling with that a little bit, and not being able to get the medical resources. And then at the same time feeling guilty, if I went to my friend's mobile hospital to get my burns dressed, because I was like, oh gosh, they're in a war and I'm taking up resources. So it was just really difficult. And then, not being able to wear your thermals because, I was burned, so it was freezing. And there were so many challenges to sort of get through in Ukraine. I did find it a difficult place to work. And, at one point, especially in the beginning of just, I remember just being at the hotel that I always stay at, and there was just nobody there. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, am I doing something stupid in staying? Like, it's just everybody's left. And, maybe a week or two later, that's when journalists and things sort of started arriving. But I found it to be, I think of all the places that I've worked as a journalist, the one that I struggled probably to connect with the most, and I'm not really sure why that is. I found it frustrating. I found it just intense, different sort of intensity that wasn't. I just, I think a lot of issues for me really came up. I felt myself very angry, probably for the first time in my life, and I'm not an angry person. I was very angry at the amount of sort of oftentimes Americans or Westerners that were creating these sort of GoFundMe pages. And unlike Afghanistan, which I lived in last year, where people couldn't just freewheel their way to Afghanistan, you needed a visa. But with Ukraine, it was sort of a free-for-all. So you had every man and his dog there with a GoFundMe page, pretending to do whatever it was, from evacuations to give money so I can fight, whatever. And I felt like it had become very exploitive of Americans and that were wanting to help the conflict. And yet I'm seeing all these people, and sometimes people I know, and I'm thinking to myself, you're raising hundreds, thousands, if not millions of dollars. What are you doing with it? And I saw a lot of showboating and people wanting, just to post a picture of how, heroic they are. And it really made me angry because I'd never seen it to that extent, just this sort of self aggrandizing, really. And then also, as a journalist, I felt very uncomfortable with, I'll give you sort of one example being, I'm sure you went there, and it was sort of the first day of the evacuations in Iraq. And, you had people that were coming, in these streams off the bridge that had been blown up. And, these are heavily traumatized people. They've been in their basement for, I think at that point, 10 days. No food, no water, it's freezing, no electricity. They don't know what's happening. They don't, they've been under bombardment. They don't know what is going on with their country. They haven't, it's this incredible amount of shock, and there's people, injured and bleeding out. It was this incredibly intense environment, and you sort of had a lot of Russian artillery very close, and people getting hit very close, and you sort of just have this pack of journalists, and everybody's sort of running, and I'm just seeing people shove phones into people's faces and microphones and screaming questions at them and taking their close up picture, and I'm thinking, it just, from a moral point of view, and it is a struggle because I understand the need to get the story. I understand the need to, really highlight the suffering and put it out there in whatever way possible. But to me, it was done in a way that I did not feel was dignified. And maybe that's why I'm not the greatest breaking news reporter in the world, where I prefer to take my time with things, because I just cannot be that person. I have to ask their permission. I have to be very gentle. Because I really believe in being a human first. And what I saw was, the word I used to describe it was kind of like vultures. And it made me sort of very angry. And at that point, I ripped the press thing off my Kevlar, and I didn't want anything to do with it at that point. So there was just a multitude of factors that was sort of going into it that made the experience, an incredible challenge. But what the story, being what Ukraine was sort of able to do and defending the capital in those early days is super incredible. And you meet really just incredibly resilient people. And so there certainly is all that element of it. But yeah, Ukraine for me, I was ready to go. I was ready to get out, and I'm grateful I could, but yeah.
No, yeah. Well, first thing, when you said burns, was that from Ukraine, or was that another injury from?
No, that was sort of just an accident in my hotel with this exploding water situation. It kind of happened, I think it was the second day of the invasion, and it was a curfew, and I couldn't get anything. I had a very small amount in my kit, and I couldn't get any burn. I was worried about infection. Mm-hmm. It made that first couple of weeks, an extra layer of challenge. But that's what happens, and I'm very grateful. Everything was fine, and I didn't get an infection. That was more my concern.
Yeah, no, the Danish journalist who was injured, he told me when he was in a field hospital, and he took 3 bullets, that they ran out of morphine the third day, and they were just giving him Advil. Talent just to and he's all good. He's still All his limbs are fine, and he has a lot of work on one of
Yeah.
his legs. But I completely had the same frustration. I took a break from journalism, especially after the Mosul operation. I was there from the beginning all the way through July, and I was just kind of like, I was like, F this, like I'm done. And that's kind of where journalism was really changing landscape wise, at least for foreign affairs type budgets. And and then COVID happened and it took more time off. And then I was like, then Ukraine happened. I've had previous connections there. So I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to go. And I had some connections there, and I knew Brent was going to be there. And then when that happened with him, and that, I was just kind of like, well, I just need to really make sure, what I'm doing for the right reasons. Which is always something most journalists should calculate. Like, what's your story, and can you actually tell it? Because if you can't tell it, why are you're going to go there? Other than you're going to be the story, which a lot of journalists, unfortunately, there was a lot of stories. It was about what happened to them, which is fine. Like, I think those are important to tell, but you saw a lot of that from what I could tell, a lot of stories about themselves, which another issue, same frustration I just got tired of all the volunteers, like asking me, hey, can I get certain supplies across the border from Poland? I was like, no, what are you talking about? And them trying to, thinking that they're going to get new weapons. And I'm like, no, you're going to get maybe boots. And that's about it. So it was a giant frustration of just one logistical nightmare on top of, you had all sorts of people coming in. But yeah, I think Ukraine, I think the current situation, is so focused, I guess, on Donbass. And I was just wondering, what's your take on Ukraine, and how you see, like, as far as stories wise, is going to be mostly focused, I guess, on Donbass, on the frontline part, and then I guess the political side of what's happening in Kyiv.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's going to end up scaling back to, I mean, we have to remember that this is a conflict that's been going on since 2014. So it's not necessarily new, even though few people were really aware that it was kind of even happening, I think. So I think what you will see, again, I could be wrong, but obviously Russia failed in its, ability to try to take Kiev or any other places. So now you're sort of looking at them probably concentrating their energies in that eastern area and taking as much of Donbass as possible, which Ukraine won't, is determined that it's going to continue to fight, and it's not prepared to surrender its territory to Russia, which is understandable. But I think what we'll end up seeing is sort of the expansion on something that really has been going on already a long time. It's just going to be to a more heightened degree at this point. I hope that the rest of the country can kind of normalize a little bit at least. But it's certainly sort of going to be, I think, I mean, if it's already been going on for 8 years anyway, it's sort of, I think, going to be a continued slog in that part of the world. And, if Ukraine can, make grounds, it may try to then take territory back. But I do think that is a little bit far off and is a little bit optimistic. And I do think, we focus a lot on the Russian propaganda, which is obviously important. Russian propaganda from the beginning has been kind of insane. But we sort of tend to whitewash the Ukraine propaganda at the same time. And there is certainly a lot of Ukraine propaganda that I think, is continuing to come out, has been coming out. And of course, I understand the idea of morale and trying to keep people positive. But a journalist's job is to sort of vet the information and project a truthful picture. And I think that we sort of didn't see a lot of that, especially in the kind of early phase of the invasion.
So what was some of if you were to say, between freelancing and working with Fox, what were some of the first things you kind of were like, it was a big change for you, big experience outside of like, oh yeah, your budgets are gone. But and this is more of like for questions for like people like who are maybe journalists who are thinking about going independent, because independent media is kind of rising. More so, more people are following individuals. So just kind of want to give because you've done both really, really well. So just your take between the differences.
I think when I was younger, Fox was a great training ground. It really comes down to who you work with. And I was really fortunate to have sort of really great managers for most of my career, people that really supported my work and kind of, enabled me to have those opportunities and to kind of do it my way, which, I always liked. And then I want to say, once I'd moved to New York, I left Los Angeles at beginning of 2017 and you sort of thrown into a much more corporate vortex. And then I think things became a lot more corporate in my last sort of few years there. And that really model wasn't for me. And suddenly I think, you look at the media landscape, then it was changing. There was no longer budgets for the foreign reporting. It had become sort of a lot more of the focus just on getting stories out and SEO and clickbait headlines and sort of things that I can't, the part of me just cannot do that, to a degree. And you try to be a team player as much as possible. But when you're sort of being dictated things in that way and not really having the time or the opportunities to really delve into a story and to do it justice. And that was the part that just, kept me up at night. And so it's sort of become increasingly unhappy and just really not being able to do the journalism that I felt was important and as I said, doing justice to a story. So I left there at it was the beginning of 2021, so just 18 months ago, really. And it's very scary. That was the only job I'd had. I'd been there since I was 20. And I think in some ways, it's obviously great when you're going into a big platform at a young age, but in another way, it can also become a little bit of a trap because you suddenly look at here you have this great platform, but if you're still not quite doing the work you want to do, you're afraid to leave it to go into something that might be smaller or less money or whatever it is, because you worry about losing that big platform that you had. And so it is a double-edged sword. And I see that a lot with a lot of young journalists going into, these big outlets when they're very young, and then kind of getting stuck there for the next 4 decades of their life. So I think that I was put a part of that, and obviously the upside when you're working for a name with a place with name recognition all over the world is access. You're going to be able to get a great interview. People are going to respond to your interview. When you travel, you're going to be able to sit down with whomever, really. So that is obviously a great advantage, and that to me was something I was obviously concerned with leaving, but you do develop the relationships over time, and you do that does serve you. It's not as easy as maybe it was when I was at Fox, but it's different. I think that there will be people that will go away in your life, and that was certainly something I was also prepared for, because I felt it was this sort of strange it was this strange thing. So when I would go out, to an event or to dinner or to something in New York, people or friends, they introduce you as Hollie from Fox. And, it did bother me because I thought, I'm just Hollie, really. Like the whole Fox thing, I don't know why that needs to be part of the conversation. It still is. I was with friends on a weekend. It was like, this was Hollie from Fox. And I'm like, it just, it becomes wrapped up in your identity, and that's just not me. I work for myself. Whatever else I do is a branch from that. So, you do really have to shed a lot of yourself when, you've been entrenched in that world for so long. But what I really wanted at that point in my career was to better focus on my book work, to focus on the work that I wanted to do, which was the features. I didn't want to be part of daily news. I don't, and still now, I don't follow the daily news trends. I don't run to breaking news. I find wherever it is the story that I want to tell or think I can tell or can, get the resources to tell. And that is the sort of journalism that I wanted to do, and much more sort of first person as well. I'm kind of bringing people in in a much more narrative way, as opposed to a little bit more of the dry, sort of distant third person news reporting, which I had done enough of in my career, and I wanted to sort of be able to really focus on my writing in a different way. So it certainly was a challenge, and there was a lot of sort of roller coaster moments, I think, in the beginning of that first month or whatever. And then I sort of made the decision that I went to El Salvador to do some work there, and then I decided to move to Afghanistan. I decided to move in May of last year, and figured I would sort of spend 4 or 5 months there. Ended up staying a lot longer, but I wanted to, sort of document that last part of the U.S. presence really in Afghanistan, which is what I thought I was going to be doing, and sort of have a base there, and to kind of be able to use my opportunity as a freelancer. That was something I couldn't do, with Fox, was just get up and move
Right.
to a new country, let alone a war zone. And so I wanted to do that, and that obviously, I think the timing, as horrible as it is for me as a freelancer, being one of the sort of few journalists that were there during the fall, and then I think one of the very few, especially American journalists, who decided to stay, when everybody else had left, and I just was determined that I wanted to at least stay there through to the end of the year, and so I think as a freelancer, that can put you in really good stead if you can kind of calculate those situations well, and be able to flourish those contacts, because suddenly you're able to people are coming to you for that news. So that was just timing wise was
Yeah, you've been
was
good with
beneficial as
timing.
a freelancer.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've always
Afghanistan,
had
that
that instinct, I
yeah.
think.
That's huge
Yeah.
though. Like it's way different being there when stuff happens versus when it happens and then trying to get in.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So yeah, that was an interesting time, and I would have honestly been happy to stay in Afghanistan. I had my house there. We had different journalists that would come and stay with us. Go to my little cafes. We'd have parties. So I was happy there. But I think once you hit a certain point in life, um, you sort of feel that need, I think, for a little bit more stability, or a little bit more connection, and family and things like that. So I think, if I was 10 years younger, I may have just stayed and lived there. But I think at some point in time, you do really realize, as much as you love your work and so committed to your work, for me, it was, I love what I do. I'm so blessed to be doing it, but this can't be everything, and I think sometimes not everybody gets that point, but for me, it's something I've been really, I guess, reckoning with, especially over the past sort of 6 months.
Yeah, I'm same boat. Like I've been married 7 years, and then I just I have a 5 month old kid, and uh but yeah, those first 8 years I was, gone 8 months out of the year. And so I luckily married a very independent, awesome person, and it's like, so, and it's the work, this type of work that you do, as you know, you have to love it, and you have to live in airports, and you know, but that's part of but you do get, like for me, I definitely, when COVID hit, I was just like, I didn't really have time to think about like all the travel, all the stuff, and you kind of just like sit back and like, oh, do I miss getting on a plane and packing and figuring all those logistical things? And because that logistical stuff is what.
Oh, I did. I was one of those horrible people that was on a plane like 2 weeks in. I was like, all right, I'm done. I'm going to Alaska.
When I was in Ukraine, I mean, I enjoyed being back out there, hanging with the local people, finding stories, filming. But yeah, as we were talked earlier, it wasn't, it was a very difficult country as far as like influx of people coming in and journalists. And one of the things I noticed, just the coverage of it. You had, obviously mainstream covering, and they would get incredible stories. A lot of it was focused on Zelensky and them getting interviews from them, but I was really following all these new open source Instagram accounts, you know, like Atlas News, and then you have people like Popular Front, you have like Northern Provisions, and then I would follow individual journalists who were in certain areas. So that being said, how do you see, what's your take on independent media now as far as yourself? Where do you like to align yourself as far as like, do you feel like you have to make yourself as a brand and continue publishing with other places? But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I get the whole brand thing, you know, people do that, but I don't know. That sounds like too much sort of Hollywood shit for me. I just do the work. Really, that's it. I do the work and try to, you know, hopefully it's compelling enough for people to have an interest in reading it. I am sort of focused right now. Obviously, I'm still doing a little bit of freelancing, sort of op-ed, sort of here and there, but really just focused on my books. And then I'm working with a sort of an exciting new development. It hasn't fully launched yet, but it's Liberty Dispatches, and it's sort of run by some veterans that have sort of long been in the game and are actually great mentors to me. And they have, you know, brought me in, and I'm their sort of content director. So it's sort of a combination of so it's not a media platform, which is actually great because I can kind of do what I want with it because I'm running the media side. But I can, you know, do a combination of obviously the human interest in the war stories that are going to be of interest to the defense and military and veterans and to anybody, you know, really. But and then also because it is sort of blockchain, it is sort of looking at different ways of implementing blockchain in national security, looking at, you know, crypto on the border, looking at just different, really, you know, this is an emerging concept, I think. And I think it's something that's not going to go away. It's sort of the next evolution of the internet. And it's kind of really interesting to me to sort of be part of that forefront of it. I'm still learning about it a lot myself. I'm by no means an expert, but I think that, again, being part of a startup and a startup that's well-funded and with people that get what I do in a different way, but they get it and that are really supportive of the work that I'm doing, you know, as a journalist. It's a very different environment, but it's I'm really enjoying it so far. And it's compared to sort of the daily news grind, it's this, you know, so much more, you know, I have much more time to really invest in the investigative aspect and in working out where I want to travel to. And so, yeah, it's sort of interesting to be part of something new that you can kind of build up as opposed to sort of being at something that's already kind of huge. And I think that, yeah, it's a challenge in a different way. So I'm enjoying it from that perspective.
Yeah, I just think timing wise, as far as people consuming news content, I think people are looking for trustworthy individuals or smaller and I'm already doing that. Like I can follow on Twitter or Instagram of literally them being there within minutes of what the reporting is. And then obviously I YouTube is a big thing for me. I really like YouTube and I still think it's going to continue to grow.
And I think sort of beginning last year too, I also started a Substack, which I like.
Oh, cool.
It's sort of a different way. And I think it's great for independent journalism. And I can, you know, it's a chance for me just to kind of put out what I've published in that particular week and have a bit of a conversation too about the backstory of those stories and provide some unique and different perspective. So I really love Substack as a model for independent journalists. You know, the way I sort of look at it, it's, you know, a little bit of pocket money on the side, but it's free content. You know, you don't have to pay for it. If you choose to, that's on you and thank you. But it's, you know, by no means, it's more just me wanting to put that information out. So I really love that model for independent journalism. I think that's it's a great and you know, a really simple way of doing things, but I think it's a great chance, and there's a lot of big journalists on there, and I think it's just a great chance for everybody to kind of put their words and thoughts out there, and to be able to monetize it a little bit too.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some learning curves with it all, but I think the timing of how people are looking for it is way bigger. If you were to say this like 5 years ago, people it would have been very hard. But I think now there's a real market for it. So
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, Hollie, thank you so much for taking your time, and I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you, and good luck with the family in the next assignment.